Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into those strange little mistakes we all make. Forgetting a name, saying the completely wrong word. We're going to ask a pretty radical question, one that Sigmund Freud himself posed. What if they're not mistakes at all? So let's start with something we've all been through. That super frustrating moment when a name you know is right on the tip of your tongue, but it's just gone. Your brain either gives you a total blank or, maybe even worse, it serves up a completely different name instead. Well, Sigmund Freud had a wild idea about this. He believed these everyday slip-ups aren't just random brain glitches. Nope. He thought they were really meaningful clues, like little secret messages bubbling up from our unconscious mind, the part of us we can't normally see. He actually gave these slips a fancy name, parapraxis. And he built this entire theory to explain them, all by analyzing one of his own really puzzling memory lapses. He basically used his own mind as the first laboratory. Okay, so let's get into it. This is the case that Freud used to launch his whole theory in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And believe it or not, it all kicks off with a totally normal conversation. Just imagine the scene, right? Freud is traveling by carriage, probably looking out at the countryside, and he's deep in conversation with a total stranger. They're just chatting about art and culture and their travels in Italy. And he wants to talk about these incredible, famous frescoes in a cathedral in Orvieto, these really powerful paintings about the end of the world. But then it happens. A crucial piece of the puzzle just vanishes, the painter's name. He absolutely knows the name isn't Botticelli and it isn't Boltraffio, but those are the only two names that keep popping into his head. The correct name, Signorelli, is just stuck. Now, for most of us, this is just an annoying brain fart, right? But for Freud, this was the beginning of an investigation. And this is the key. Freud doesn't just shrug it off. He treats this moment like a crime scene. And those two wrong names, Botticelli and Boltraffio, they're his main clues. He's convinced they didn't just show up randomly. So, Freud decides he has to rewind the tape. He has to look at what they were talking about right before this memory lapse happened. And he remembers, just before they got onto Italian art, he and his travel buddy were talking about the customs of the Turks living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. His companion tells him this story about the locals' attitude towards life's biggest forces. Apparently, they had this deep trust in fate when it came to dying, but they'd fall into total despair if they were faced with sexual problems. And this conversation plants these two really powerful ideas in Freud's mind, death and sexuality. And you'll want to pay attention to that word Herr. It's German for Sir or Mister. That's going to become a huge clue in a minute. Suddenly, it clicks for Freud. He realizes that those topics, death and sexuality, are unconsciously linked to a really painful memory he'd been trying to push down. He'd recently heard news while he was in a town called Tranifoy that one of his patients had taken his own life because of an incurable sexual disorder. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. This is how Freud mapped out all the connections. The names Bosnia and Herzegovina from that earlier chat, they get kind of chopped up and attached to the wrong names. You see the bow from Bosnia in Botticelli. And check out Boltraffio. It has a direct link to Trafoi, the place where he heard about the suicide. Even the name he forgot, Signorelli, gets broken apart. Signor, which is Italian for Herr, links right back to that patient's quote. It's like the disturbing thought he was trying to suppress literally hijacked the name, broke it into pieces, and used the parts as a disguise. So you might be thinking, okay, that's a cool word puzzle, but so what? Well, for Freud, this wasn't just about one forgotten name. It was a perfect model for how our entire inner world operates. So, parapraxis, that's the official technical term for the slip itself. It's the mistake that gives you the clue. Forgetting Signorelli and having Botticelli and Boltraffio pop up instead, that is a classic parapraxis. And if the slip is the clue, then repression is the motive for the crime. It's the mind actively trying to shove away a painful memory, in this case about his patient. But here's the thing. Repression is never perfect. All that psychic energy, it has to go somewhere.
So those disturbing thoughts about death and sexuality, they basically acted like a jammer. They interfered with his attempt to just simply recall the name. The force of that repression shattered the name Signorelli, and its pieces got displaced or attached to other, safer words that were just kind of floating around in his mind from the earlier conversation.
For Freud, this was a genuine revelation. This wasn't just about one name. It suggested that absolutely nothing in our mental life is random or an accident. Every little slip, every mistake has a reason, and it's determined by a whole chain of unconscious thoughts. So, why does this one specific case matter so much? Because Freud was convinced that this exact same mechanism is at work in all of us every single day. Freud basically boils it down to a 3-part recipe for this kind of memory slip. First, you're not super invested in remembering the name in the first place. Second, you've recently pushed down some kind of unpleasant thought. And third, and this is the key, there's a link, even a really faint one, between that suppressed thought and the name you're trying to remember. So the real takeaway here is that these little mental glitches, they're not just noise. They're actually windows into our inner conflicts and our repressed thoughts. In Freud's view, they're one of the main highways to understanding the unconscious mind. It's a really provocative idea, right? It totally changes how you might look at your own everyday mistakes. The next time you make one, you have to wonder, is it just a random error, or is it a signal from a hidden part of yourself trying to say hello? That's the question Freud leaves us with.